It's 1988. Anitra Washington, a 30-year-old black woman, is walking down the street in Los Angeles, heading to a friend's house one evening. She's focused, minding her own business, when an orange Ford Pinto pulls up beside her. The driver, a man, leans out of the window with a smile. He's friendly, charismatic, and neatly dressed. He offers her a ride. Anitra hesitates. She is cautious, so she politely declines the offer and begins to walk away. But then, the man's demeanor changes, and he snaps. "That's what's wrong with you black women. People can't be nice to you." Anitra stops in her tracks, feeling sorry for him. It's a nice gesture, and he seems like a gentleman. It's just a ride, she thought. She ultimately accepts the ride, but that was a big mistake that would change the course of her life forever. A short while after Anitra enters this stranger's car, she suddenly feels a sharp pain in her chest. She looks down and is horrified to see blood soaking through her clothes. She realized she has been shot. With her heart pounding out of her chest and her whole body trembling in shock, she asked the man, "Why? Why did you shoot me?" The man responded with a stern voice, "You disrespected me." He drives her to a secluded area where the nightmare continues. Anitra begins to fade in and out of consciousness and awoke to him sexually assaulting her. She blacks out again, but woke up to the flash of a Polaroid camera in her face. When he's done, he shoves her out of the car like trash and speeds away, leaving her to die. When the man pushed Anitra out of his car and drove off, he thought he had left her for dead. But Anitra wasn't ready to give up. Badly wounded and bleeding heavily, Anitra picked herself up off the street, and with all the strength she could muster, stumbled many blocks to the house of a friend who called an ambulance. However, despite giving a description of her attacker, the orange Pinto car, and taking the police to the street where he'd left her to die, he was never caught, and soon after, the case went cold. Poor Anitra was not his first victim, and neither would she be his last. She was his only survivor and would go on to give her testimony several years later. In fact, a few years earlier, bodies of young black women had begun appearing in alleys and dumpsters across South Los Angeles. Each one showed signs of similar brutality: sexual assault, strangulation, or gunshot wounds. The case we are about to cover is of a man who deceived everyone: the police, his friends, the neighbors, and even his own family. He did not fit the profile of a serial killer. For 25 years, he roamed the streets of South Los Angeles, taking the lives of young and vulnerable black women. The police were called to the crime scenes, but there were no witnesses, no fingerprints, no leads. It was as if the killer vanished into thin air after each attack. Over time, the police start to connect the dots. They discover the victims have one thing in common: vulnerability. Many of them were women struggling with addiction, homelessness, or living on the fringes of society. And that's what made their deaths easy to overlook. But even with this emerging pattern, there was no evidence or clues. The killer knew exactly how to evade detection. The cases were quietly shelved, one after the other. The victims' lives and deaths were overlooked and almost forgotten. Then, in 1988, the same year Anitra was attacked and left for dead, the killings suddenly stopped. The city, for a moment, breathed a sigh of relief. People began to think the killer had either died or been arrested for another crime. The killer would go silent for 14 long years until 2002, when he would strike again, earning him the nickname the Grim Sleeper. This time, the victim is 15-year-old Princess Bertomeu, a 15-year-old runaway found strangled, followed shortly after by a 35-year-old mother of two, Valerie McCorvey, in 2003. This is the early 2000s, and by this time, the world of criminal investigations had changed. DNA technology is advanced. The Los Angeles Police Department had started a cold case unit, and detectives are ready to test everything they have. They begin by re-examining old evidence with new tools. They reanalyzed evidence from the 1980s murders that have been gathering dust for years, hoping they could find some connection that might lead to a break in the case. And they do. The same DNA was present at multiple crime scenes. It confirmed what they already suspected. However, when detectives try to find a DNA match, they hit a brick wall. The DNA did not match anyone in their database. It was as if the killer had never been arrested and never left a single trace in official records. Despite the efforts of the detectives, the trail of the killer went cold again. Years go by, and in 2007, the body of Janisha Peters, a 25-year-old woman, was found stuffed in a garbage bag and left in a dumpster. Saliva on the garbage bag provided DNA evidence that matched samples from some of the 1980s cold cases. It was also linked to samples recovered from the murders of Princess Berthomieu and Valerie McCorvey, who was strangled in 2003. But then, something unexpected happens, a breakthrough that no one could have ever predicted. A young man named Christopher was arrested by the police for felony weapons possession in 2009. As part of routine processing, his DNA swab was collected and filed into the system. By 2010, investigators decide to revisit the case using modern DNA technology. They decide to try something new, a familial DNA search. That was when they discovered that Christopher, the young man who they had arrested months ago for felony weapons possession, was a close match to the killer's DNA. But Christopher was too young to have committed the murders decades ago. So investigators looked into his family and realized that his father, Lonnie David Franklin, a 58-year-old man who didn't fit the profile of a serial killer, was the likely perpetrator. Now they need proof. They have a suspect, but they don't have a smoking gun. Detectives follow Franklin for weeks, watching him closely on 24-hour surveillance, hoping for an opportunity to collect a sample of his DNA. They finally get their chance when Franklin walks into a pizza shop one night. He buys a slice of pizza, takes a few bites, and casually tosses the remaining crust into a nearby trash can. An officer working undercover as a busboy collected Franklin's plate, cup, and pizza crust, which had enough DNA to finally convict him of the murders. A few days later, DNA taken from the pizza slice came back as a match to the DNA from the saliva found on one of Franklin's victims. It also matched the evidence found at the crime scenes from the 1980s murders, and so Franklin was immediately arrested. Lonnie David Franklin, a family man, the friendly neighbor who fixed cars, hosted barbecues, and had everyone believe he was just a nice man, was a cold, calculated, and cruel serial killer who terrorized the streets of Los Angeles for 25 years. Franklin was a former corporal in the United States Army who also worked as a Los Angeles City trash collector and as a garage attendant at a Los Angeles Police Department station. During the 3-day search of Franklin's property, investigators found more than 1,000 photographs and video recordings of various women, many of whom were unconscious or in disturbing positions. Some were even victims of his violent acts. Personal items were also found: women's necklaces, rings, earrings, and watches, trophies taken from his victims. As police combed through his house, it became clear that Franklin had been hiding his true identity for decades, a man living a double life. To his family and neighbors, he was a charming, hard-working mechanic. To his victims, he was a monster hiding in plain sight. Franklin had committed his first murder in 1984 at the age of 32. He chose victims the authorities wouldn't care about. His victims include Valerie McCorvey, Henrietta Wright, Bernita Sparks, Alicia Alexander, Princess Berthomieu, Barbara Ware, Mary Lowe, Lacrica Jefferson, Janisha Peters, Deborah Jackson. They ranged in age from 15 to 35. They were mothers, sisters, and daughters, each with hopes and plans. But their lives were cruelly cut short by Lonnie David Franklin. Some of the women were addicted to drugs, or they had been forced by circumstances to work as prostitutes on the dangerous streets, making them easy prey for Franklin. It's common for serial killers to take breaks in between killings, but a 14-year gap does not seem likely. By 2016, Lonnie Franklin Jr. stood trial for the murders of at least 10 women. Police believe he murdered many more women, or at least 6 more. Franklin was convicted and sentenced to death. For the victims and their families, the scars will never fully heal. The verdict could never erase the pain. They had waited so long for justice, and even though it had finally come, it felt like it was too late. On March 28, 2020, Franklin was found unresponsive in his prison cell. Prison medical staff rendered aid and summoned an ambulance. He was pronounced dead several minutes later. His death was from natural causes related to heart problems and high blood pressure. Sometimes, the face of evil isn't what we expect. It's not always the monster lurking in the dark. It's the nice man living down the street.